Hello, welcome to the Rev and the Rav. This is a program of interreligious dialogue and discovery. I am Nick Carter, president of Andover Newton Theological School.
And I'm Daniel Lehmann, president of Hebrew College.
We welcome you here today. We've been reading in the media recently quite a bit about denominations and the struggles that denominations have been having. Some are having to sell buildings and sell campuses of things that have been in existence for 50, 60, 100 years or more. And it really has invited an interesting debate amongst the religious communities about the presence of denominations, their value, and their future. Danny, you know, was always been curious about Hebrew College's rabbinical school, which this year is celebrating its 10th anniversary, a very exciting celebration coming up. But it was founded in some ways differently than most rabbinical schools, something, I wouldn't say outside denominations, but in a very interesting twist. What was your analysis of, I mean, what's the situation here as you relate to denominations? What were the choices you all made?
Well, it's interesting. My predecessor, when he founded the rabbinical school 10 years ago, used the term transdenominational, which meant that we were going to train rabbis that could potentially serve different denominations depending on their own religious predilections and commitments. We've actually moved away from that term of transdenominational, and we talk more about a pluralistic rabbinical school, even a post-denominational rabbinical school.
That's used a lot now. The folks are
It is, because I think we're responding to a reality in which the whole denominational structure within Judaism, Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, Orthodox, which were 20th century phenomenon, really 19th century and 20th century phenomenon, are now waning. And the recent Pew study of American Jews found that people are much less denominationally focused. Even those people who consider themselves religious, there's a growing percentage that do not affiliate with any of those mainstream denominations.
Yeah, now, you named 4 denominations. Are the Jews spread out evenly amongst those 4 denominations, and also then I know that you often talk about a cultural Jew that's not a practicing Jew that maybe is the 5th denomination, or give a sense of the percentage in each of those roughly.
Right. So the largest in the Pew study clearly is the Reform movement, and they're really the oldest movement with a rabbinical school and a congregational organization in the United States. And they took root in the 19th century and developed a lot of those centralized institutions in the latter quarter of the 19th century. So they have about 40% of the American Jewish population. The conservative movement, which used to be the largest in the post-World War II years, has diminished to now it's about 18%. And the Orthodox has grown a little bit because of just their growth in families and childbirth, and they're at about 10%.
And Reconstructionists?
Reconstructionists is even smaller than that, a couple of percent maybe. It's always been the smallest. And then you have people who are what we call Jewish renewal, which actually does have a rabbinical school, an online rabbinical school called Aleph. And you have cultural Jews, which make up, in some ways, the larger portion of the Jewish community, people who are proud to be Jewish and identify themselves as Jews, but do not consider themselves Jewish by any religious affiliation or category. And this rabbinical school is really designed to respond to the flux within the Jewish community. Because one of the things that the Pew study found is that if you're brought up in a certain denomination, there's a strong likelihood that you will not continue to be a member of that denomination as you become an adult. And in fact, the Reform movement retained just about 55% of those who grow up, but the Orthodox and the conservative movement, the majority actually leave the movement. And the Pew study found that almost all of the movement from one denomination to another is in the direction of less traditional Judaism. So there's a clear vector towards less religious tradition and even towards Jewish affiliation that's not religious. So the rabbinical school here was really designed to be able to cull from the different strengths of the denominations, their different approach to Jewish study, to Jewish social justice, to Jewish ethics and worship, and then to be able to have rabbis who can, in a sense, shape their own vision of Judaism and their own sense of communal leadership in a more creative and expressive way than would be dictated by the denominations. But the denominations still control, through their congregational arm and their rabbinic placement services, a lot of the institutional infrastructure of American Judaism, and it's a bit of a union shop. And it's been interesting to see congregations who want to hire our rabbinical graduates having to go outside of that whole elaborate system that the denominations have constructed.
Fascinating, fascinating.
And what do you find in the Protestant mainline churches in terms of the vibrancy of the denominational structure?
Well, of course, we've got this huge cornucopia of 60 or 70 different vegetables.
Which, from the Jewish perspective, we have no idea really how to distinguish them.
Right. It takes some doing. In many ways, one of the questions that you could see in terms of placing is to think of a continuum and ask the question of where does the denomination find authority? And on one end is authority within tradition, and the other is authority within the Bible or within the church or itself. And like Roman Catholicism is heavy at one end in terms of tradition, and Episcopalian churches and some of the other heavy liturgical churches.
Is the Methodists also on that side?
Methodist, Lutheran. But by the time you get to the other end, you get into Baptists and then Quakers and Amish and folks have very different sense of where they are. But on the question of denominational identity, I think we share in that sense of whether it's a post-denominational age, I don't know. Like, I'm not sure that I'm ready to say that denominations are over.
No, I wouldn't make that claim either. I would just say that they're weakening and there's something else that's taking their place.
It is true that research shows now that the average minister looks out at his or her Protestant minister looks out at her congregation on Sunday morning, and over 50% of that church did not grow up in that faith tradition.
And your students, when they graduate, they're ordained by the denomination, and you have a bunch of denominations represented at Andover Newton.
That's true. That it is the denomination that ordains. In many cases, that also plays out on that continuum about who actually does the ordaining.
Right.
Is it the body of the church, or is it the local church? Is it the denomination, or is it the local church?
So it's interesting. In American Judaism, it's really the rabbinical school that ordains. Even in the denominational seminaries, you're not ordained by the denomination, except that your ordination from the rabbinical school, if it's a denominational rabbinical school, is representing that denomination. But your actual ordination certificate is coming from this academic institution, and in our case, Hebrew College ordains. And people ask me all the time, even within the Jewish community, so in what denomination are they ordained? And I say to them, they're not ordained in a denomination. They're ordained by Hebrew College, and then they choose what kind of religious community they're going to serve.
And ours is very different in that essentially what we're doing is we're saying they're prepared and ready to be ordained, and then
By some other body.
By some other body, and then depending on how the polity of that body works, there's some coaching that help and some courses that people take that are specific to them, so they'll be ready for that. And many of the students, while they're in seminary, are in a care program, a sponsored program, and there are certain requirements that vary from denomination of things that they have to have, experiences they have to have, and ordination papers that they have to write, and ordination councils that they have to endure. But that's not the seminary's business.
Right.
Now, an interesting piece of this is that there used to be this sort of relay between the seminary and the church. Increasingly, we're finding that the churches are looking to the seminary to do more of this. We used to call it the difference between the preparation for ministry and the formation. We're now doing much more in terms of formation, and we're not necessarily interested in forming to a specific denomination.
Right. And in our case, those graduates who want to become members of Jewish denominations and the rabbinic associations would then apply, and depending on the rules of that denomination, may be qualified or may not be qualified by their ordination from us. Typically, they are in the liberal branches of Judaism, and then there's a whole process where they have to spend certain years working in that denominational setting and applying and meeting certain criteria. But I'm wondering, are you finding more and more that your graduates are going to serve churches or communities that are not denominationally affiliated?
There's a growing number of churches that, whether you call it transdenominational or post-denominational or community churches, that many are moving towards that, although it still is a minority of churches.
Yeah, we have the same phenomenon called independent synagogues or minyanim, prayer groups, and it's a growing phenomenon, but it's still, I think, a very small proportion.
Right.
Of
What we are seeing
affiliation.
more increasingly, at least within churches that are clustered in one part of the spectrum, that there's some easy movement of, for instance, American Baptists and United Church of Christ, Presbyterians, and some of those traditions, Disciples of Christ. That there's some easy movement, and churches are increasingly willing to hire someone of a different tradition. It gets a little more sticky when you get to the Methodist Church and to the Episcopal Church in terms of some of their traditions.
Right. We're also finding that congregations are merging across denominational lines. So you'll have Reform and conservative congregations merging because of diminished membership, and they're trying to create viable critical masses of folks, and for viability reasons, and they're attracted to our graduates because we can bring sort of both of those traditions to
I think we see increasingly. I think that the small churches that are struggling, that are merging, are much more open to having one of a different tradition as they go. I think there are some interesting questions for all of us around the future of denominations. And what those denominations bring in terms of some spice to the mix, different theological interpretations and things. But because they're relatively new, just a couple hundred years old, that in terms of the life of religion, we can probably get through this time. And actually, it's kind of an interesting moment.
It is. It's definitely a time of shift, and I think a lot of the millennials, as we call them, are less interested in some of these institutional structures and are finding new ways to create community that go beyond the denominational constructs that have been created over the last 100
Sure. I find
or so
myself, there was some interesting research that the Southern Baptists did about prospects for seminary, and one of the things that they found was an increasingly increasing lack of interest in traditional church and definitely in denominations, of wanting to go directly to be of service. And I found myself calling them passionaries.
Right.
It's a new twist on missionaries, of people who just want to roll up their sleeves and go to work, and they're not interested whether you're this flavor or that flavor.
But I also think there's that trend even among those who are focused on spirituality, that there's a desire to have a diverse group of people coming from different backgrounds and perspectives and not be put into the boxes of the denominational labels. Well, it's certainly an interesting time to be involved in the formation and development of religious leadership. There are a lot of shifts taking place in the landscape, and we're very much at the cutting edge of some of these important trends. So I want to thank you for joining us for the Rev And The Rav today. My name is Rabbi Daniel Lehmann, president of Hebrew College. Shalom.
Nick Carter, president of Andover Newton. Peace.